Welcome to the Agile Localization Podcast by Crowdin, where we unpack the strategies and solutions that make localization fast, scalable, and efficient. I'm your host, Stefan Huyghe. Good morning from the summery Texas. Lots of heat here. We are welcoming Aaron Presley with OnPurpose Studio this morning at the Agile Localization Podcast by Crowdin. And Aaron, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself a second?
Yeah, sure. So happy to be here. My name's Aaron. I'm originally from Texas, so I've got that with you. I'm currently in Oregon on the West Coast. My name's Aaron. I'm the localization architect at OnPurpose Studio. We help companies with their localization tech stack. So really anything that's on the technical or the development side of localizing a code base, that's really what we help companies with.
Yeah, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about UX implementations and Adobe Experience Manager in particular. And we're looking to explore how OnPurpose is tackling localization, one of localization's biggest bottlenecks, integrating CMS platforms like Adobe Experience Manager with agile localization platforms like Crowdin. So let's get to the nitty-gritty right away. What are the biggest technical and workflow gaps you know about from working with Adobe Experience Manager and Crowdin?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest things is it's all kind of the same problem at the end of the day. And so AEM is just another example of a very complicated process of organizing localization data. So translations, locale codes, key names, all of that has a ton of complexity. And working with Crowdin, we released this AEM integrator. And yeah, it's been pretty interesting, really getting into the Adobe ecosystem. So it's been more of a business logistic issue more than a technical issue. Once we're approved for AEM and once they let you into their moat, it's a fairly straightforward technical process. The problem is, getting that access to be able to create the integration initially. But yeah, we got it done. We're really proud of it. We launched it in the Crowdin store recently, which prompted me to hang out with you here.
Yeah, if we pan out a little bit broader, why do you think so many enterprise localization teams struggle with CMS and TMS integration?
I think it's more the development side as a developer. So that's my background. I come from the world of engineering, fell in love with localization. So I have a long background as a developer, but kind of grew a passion of localization. And the localization folks often are at odds with the development folks. And that's because, in my opinion, they usually are talking about two different things. So engineers, I think, have a misunderstanding of what the low-level fundamental like APIs and libraries, they sort of misunderstand the goal of those frameworks. And that often makes it really difficult to write integrations and write these kind of systems if you don't understand the kind of mindset that you are recommended to have when you're working with localization data. So I wouldn't even say it's necessarily directly about CMSs or connections. I think it's about a development team that understands the goals and the background of the low-level APIs that developers are working with whenever they want to integrate a system. And that can be something custom, that can be a CMS, that can be, a simple plugin. And so I think it's really a training issue more than like an ability or a certain system that is particularly difficult.
Yeah, I've been a big advocate on the localization side for localization people to get a bit more knowledgeable about content management systems and global content in general, because I think that's where the whole industry is moving, content generation on the fly. How do you balance automation with the need for human review and contextual accuracy, you think?
Yeah, I think that's pretty company specific. There's no question that AI is sort of uh, causing some kind of change within the localization industry. But I think people are starting to get used to those systems and have been using them for their own personal lives in various ways and are starting to realize like, oh, it is really helpful, but I can't just completely trust it. I almost always have to edit. And so I tell companies there are contexts where if it's a low risk situation, okay, don't have human review if it's something that you genuinely don't care, if it's, the chat GPT style of writing. Uh, but some situations, like your landing page, the first of the fold, you probably want a human review for that. And so I think it's really up to the company's appetite, because with all things, there's always nuance, right?
Yeah. I'm always interested in people's background and the lessons they've learned from their experience. And you have a very high profile background experience with Nike. So I want to quickly pulse you on that, if that's okay. How did your time at Nike shape your thinking about localization architecture? Can you tell us anything more about that?
Yeah, well, Nike was my first introduction to the topic in general. So I just sort of accidentally got a job on their globalization team. I was already a software engineer pretty well into my career and got hired there. And I knew of the topics of globalization very lightly. But whenever I got hired on at Nike, I joined the team that was essentially the central point internally that would other internal teams would connect to us, and we built systems that would then connect to a bunch of different vendors that we had contractual agreements with and all these things. And the company didn't want every single individual internal team to have to care about all those logistics. And so we were that central point. And what that meant is that I was thrown into the deep end of not only writing code for translations and connecting to vendors and in an enterprise environment. That was a lot of learning, but also I was educating a lot. So the internal companies or teams rather were told, "Hey, you are a new team. You're required to go into these languages. Go talk to Aaron and he'll teach you like the basics of globalization." And so we wrote systems for these internal teams. We wrote scripts. We wrote all this stuff. And so that was really an amazing time because it's the most, it was 20 something languages, 20 something regions. And I became just like obsessed with the topic of globalization and especially learning like, okay, well, I'm some, kid from Texas. I've always been a computer nerd, and now I'm being forced gladly to learn the nuances of culture as it relates to writing code. So code is a black and white thing. Human language is not black and white. And so learning how to weave in a little bit of human language nuance into a code base is always something that has been fascinating to me ever since.
Yeah. At the large companies, there's usually a lot bigger budget for localization, so there's opportunities there that might not be available at smaller organizations. How do you think large organizations unintentionally create complexity though in their global content pipelines? And where maybe the bigger question is, where do you see the most friction when marketing, product, and engineering intersect on localization? That's a two-sided question that probably requires a bit of our attention. What do you think?
Yeah, so as far as what large companies do to sort of add unnecessary friction, I think it's really not that different of an answer than anything else you might think. So I think large companies just across all categories have a lot of process. And sometimes that's necessary and worth having. Sometimes it's not necessary and just kind of a waste of time. And so I think that certainly applies in the localization world. I think what is great about larger companies is, yeah, they do have resources to have to be able to take the time to say, okay, we really care about this specific market. We want to find someone there. We want to work within local ad agency. We want to do a good job for that region, and they hire someone and have the resources to do that. That's super awesome, and that was my favorite part of the job, is getting to work with the other localization product people that represented certain regions within Nike, and learning from them more on the linguistic side and the human language side than the coding side. And so I think a smaller company probably isn't going to have the experts there of a specific language to be able to like pepper them with questions about like, okay, well, what are the nuances of this language? And like you really get into sort of like a academic writing mode if you get really fascinated with this topic. And I think, yeah, the localization program managers and localization folks at Nike, I absolutely credit with teaching me so much about how to implement this stuff well and respect the target language.
Now, did we talk about the friction between the departments? That's an important topic too. How do you prevent that, and what are your lessons from working in a big organization with, I assume, large marketing, product, and engineering departments?
Yeah. Yeah, friction, I think, is a huge one. I'm glad we came back to that. I already forgot. Yeah, so I think there is a lot of friction, and typically, if you think about the average company of an average size that needs to be doing localization, it's probably not a teeny tiny, startup. It's probably a company of a certain size if you have this need. And usually there's a localization, expert involved somehow, program manager or translator. That I guess the people that are part of that career path usually have a background that is in writing or in linguistics, or they have moved around to a bunch of countries or can speak a bunch of languages, and that's their
Guilty as charged. Sorry.
exactly. So you're a great point. Um, and so you think of the process of localizing a company in terms of the linguistics and the human language aspect of it, which is great. The developers that are part of this process have a technical background. They're there to solve problems. They're there to be efficient, and they are taught to, certain engineering principles. And human language and implementing a localized code base is actually not very engineering efficient. And so whenever you are a localization person talking to a developer and you're saying like, hey, I'm seeing these problems or our translations are bad, and you kind of get frustrated at the developer, but the developer doesn't have a background in linguistics. They don't understand that they're solving for adverbs and subjects and nouns. They are solving for a quick, development process. And the developer doesn't know that they're doing that, and the linguist or the localization person also doesn't know, they're talking about the same thing from two different entire perspectives. And so that's really what I enjoy doing, is going into dev teams and talking to localization folks and saying like, hey, this is the problem we're all solving. This is your perspective. This is your perspective. Now let's figure out how to work together. And so I think a ton of friction just comes from different backgrounds and different perspectives on the same problem.
Yeah, it sounds like you're the kind of guy that could help organizations really change how they typically approach localization, budgeting, ROI, organization. What are your tips for organizations that are struggling with those things?
Yeah, I would say if you're an organization that's struggling with a really brittle localization process, like, oh, we need to add a new language, but our devs have no idea how that will break the system, or we used to support EN, now we want to support EN US. I think the the reason those systems typically feel brittle is because they were built with an engineering mindset and not necessarily a linguistic mindset. And so whenever companies come to us, usually I can make the problem a bit smaller for them. There's always going to be complexity in localizing a piece of code. That is never going to be a super easy process, but really this misunderstanding of the perspective makes it actually harder on companies. And so if they come to us, we usually tell them like, okay, well, let's look at where we're at, and you can start small. Developers are really great at taking a really big problem and chunking it into small pieces. The problem is that the localization topic isn't trained in development environments very often. And so it's this really big, scary issue. And it is big and scary, but it's just like every other technical problem. You just have to understand it, and then you can break it down into smaller pieces. And it's really achievable if you have that mindset.
Yeah. One of the things that I really, really like about Crowdin is that they make so many integrations and really have a finger on the pulse as far as the needs of their clients is concerned. We're involving you because you have a very specific use case with Adobe Experience Manager. Can you tell us a little bit how that came to be? Like, how did you come to make this plugin for Crowdin?
Yeah, so I work with clients a lot, and a lot of those clients are in companies of all sizes, but especially some enterprise companies. And so I kind of noticed that there are some translation management vendors that do support AAM, and AAM is just this like, for a quick background on it, it is used by like a lot of the huge enterprise companies around the world. It's been around forever, and it is a very powerful system, but it's also very difficult to integrate with. And like I mentioned before, it's not really a technical issue. It's more of a bureaucratic, long process to even get approved to be a developer. But in my work with the enterprise, we had that. We were already kind of familiar with AEM just from my enterprise background and enterprise clients. And so I kind of noticed like, hey, it doesn't seem like Crowdin has an AEM connector yet. Maybe we should do, we've already written code to help with the process of translation. AEM has translation features within it. And so we thought, hey, we might as well just plug this into Crowdin and, let anyone that wants to be more competitive, I guess, to be able to use Crowdin, because only a few translation management systems even support AEM. And so, we care a lot about helping smaller companies, get localization, and AEM isn't really a way to target that, but we do care about Crowdin, and I think Crowdin is a great system. And so I really wanted Crowdin to be able to access the enterprise level companies. And so that's really the background, is just being able to say, like, see an opportunity and, hopefully have it have it be a good income stream for us. And then also our enterprise clients have been asking for it. So
Yeah. How do you balance solving for edge cases like the one you just described and building something for scale that can grow?
yeah, I mean, the beautiful part of the localization technical side is it's almost all the same principles. No matter what system you go to, no matter what system you're integrating with, it all comes down to, you need a language code of some sort, you need a key, and there are translation jobs. There are like a few common concepts that apply across systems. And so AEM is no different. They have features within their system that allow us to plug into some translation kind of APIs. And so really we didn't reinvent the wheel. The Our background in this topic allows us to sort of know the edge cases, because there are a ton of gotchas. If you're writing code for any kind of translation data, there are a lot of gotchas to know about. But in our position, in my background, I kind of understood what I was getting into. And then as far as scalability, AEM is, pretty robust. So whenever you first send your translations, that is, hammering a system. And luckily, Crowdin is very capable of enterprise level scale. There is sort of a middle layer translation through a system that we wrote, and so we sort of have a proxy that handles the communication between Crowdin and the AEM integration. And so we have a background in writing really scalable systems, and so at the end of the day, it's all just text. And so that makes it really easy to write very robust systems. And obviously, AEM can handle it, Crowdin can handle it, and then in the middle, we have experience in handling that as well. So, yeah, it's kind of the same. It's not really any different than our typical playbook, honestly.
Yeah. You have a very interesting background that struck me right away. As a technical guy that got to language, I'm a language guy that got to database development. So that thing we have in common a little bit. And I was just wondering, how do you feel your technical background inform your product decisions?
Yeah, I think maybe a unique position I offer is that I understand the development side, and so if there's a lot of frameworks and like technical tools that are built to help with localization, but those don't really take into account a localization person's perspective. So those are usually from a developer's perspective. And then similarly, a lot of online tools that help, companies, maybe not technical, but help broader companies localize, those are really great, but they are built from a localizer's or a localization person's perspective. And so with my background in coding, my passion for localization, I can kind of speak both languages, so to speak. That's an overloaded term in this conversation, I realize, but that's kind of what I think I want to bring to companies, is be able to say, hey, devs, whenever a localization person says this, this is kind of the what they're actually meaning from a developer's perspective, and be able to do the same for someone on the localization side. Because usually those conversations between devs and the non-technical parts of the company are almost always the biggest points of friction.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about system design and thinking in data, not just language. You already brushed upon it a little bit. What does it mean to think like a localization architect, in your opinion, and how can we verbalize that to other departments?
Yeah, I think whenever I come into a company, every and I'm starting with the code base typically, and I'm talking with the engineers. Every company is slightly different, and that means their code is slightly different, but any company does follow patterns. They're using some specific language, they're using some specific architecture from the coding perspective, and each of those layers within a code base is an opportunity to either misunderstand how to localize it or an opportunity to kind of make it a bit better. And so it really is the same thing, because these systems, that like actual machines that we're talking through right now, inside of them, they are built with an understanding of human language. And your system, your phone, it is all relaying information about what language you speak. So whenever you visit a website, that website knows without you having to log in or anything. It's just your device says, hey, my preferred language is this. It can be a list of languages. And so teaching companies that, hey, you can tie into these features. They are available to you right now. It doesn't take as much code as you think. You don't have to write anything custom. Like, these systems are built to understand human language. The developers yielding them just have to use it. So whenever you say, how do you tie that into a system, or how do you think in systems? The good thing is, like, I don't really, it's the consultation is fun because it's always different. Cause like I say, every company is different, but that just means I work with them and I look at their code and I look at their architecture from a technical perspective, and I say, like, hey, I see these like 4 spots. These would be a good use case of where you should be paying attention to the locale. Or, hey, I see your database is designed this way. You could probably redesign it and do a migration to shape it this way that could store language. And, hey, don't make an assumption on EN. You should probably use ENUS, because that ends up being files in your code and that's hard to change later. So that's really what the process of a localization architect is to look at the current system and have an understanding of the lower level APIs available that are about human language, and help companies not only do it that one time, but I really like to help companies learn how to do it, without needing me in the future.
Yeah, localization and system design are intertwined in ways that a lot of people probably don't realize. Can you give us an example of a localization failure that resulted from a poor system design?
From a poor system design, I mean, I think one of the most common issues I come across, and I've touched on it a few times, is that a company is told, hey, we need to support multiple languages. So, say this is a US based company, they now need to support US Spanish. And so they say, okay, well, now we need to write this notion of English into our system. So they start supporting EN. And a lot of developers in that moment, they want to start broad, which is a development principle that is good to follow. And so they say, okay, well, let's start with EN. We'll start broad and we can go narrow later. However, they don't understand that that locale usually ends up being trickled throughout your system. So you have EN in your database, you will have EN in your files, like in your actual file names. And so it just so happens that starting broad makes it hard to change your mind later in this one specific topic. And so that's a place where the system design works initially. So you say you supported EN and then you have ES, and over time that spreads all over your code base and it's all reliant. It's kind of like an ID that floats around your code base. And then now, okay, well, we want to like support the UK, or we want to, support maybe Spain Spanish, and then also, Mexico Spanish. And so now we have to get more specific. And that's where the system design really breaks down. And that's why companies consider it really brittle to make those changes is because they took a design or a development principle of starting broad, go narrow later, but they didn't realize that localization happens to be one of those topics where your default assumptions as a developer sometimes make your life more difficult.
Yeah. Localization is often so siloed. That's a real issue. I see it all the time in my day to day where different departments at the same company have different terminologies and ways of going about things that are fighting internally. How does system design break that cycle? What's your advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe system design isn't the solve more than, like I've mentioned previously, is just making sure both sides are talking about the same thing. So an analogy I give companies is localization folks are coming to the developers saying, hey, we want to solve this problem. We want to, support Mexico Spanish and Spain Spanish. And so they, hand it over to the mechanics, the devs, and the devs are working on this thing and they're like, tweaking and oiling and doing all this maintenance, and they think, they're doing a good job, and then they hand it back, but they can't get it to fit right. And usually it's because the developers think they're working on a car and the localization people think they're working on a boat, and none of them ever, like discuss the shape of the thing they're doing. They just think the other knows their own perspective. And so that results in a lot of miscommunication and a lot of frustration. So I think the system design is a symptom of that miscommunication. And so if there's a lot of friction, I think it's just a misunderstanding of what we're solving for and the shape of that solution. So it's still the same tools, still the same, systems. It's really nothing that different. It's still nuts and bolts at the end of the day, but learning the correct perspective and having the right mindset when you're working on something is really the best solution to creating a well-designed system.
At Crowdin, obviously the focus is largely on agile localization and enabling continuous workflows at enterprise scale. What are some of the foundational components that you think an agile localization infrastructure needs to have in order to be successful?
Yeah, I think, table stakes is a process where a non-technical person can contribute translations. And from the development side, the ability to deploy new translations on the fly without having to, a localization person shouldn't have to say, hey, I fixed this typo or I added this translation. And then they tap the shoulder of a developer and the developer has to hit a button to translate or to deploy the changes. So table stakes is a continuous deployment pipeline of some sort, and the ability for a non-technical person to contribute translations somehow. I think that's really important. Obviously, there's a lot of other things you could add to that, like QA checks, having certain projects that maybe are fully AI translated versus others that, or say, okay, well, these projects are the ones where we have human translators involved and the marketing team is involved. And then as your company gets larger and larger, like, integration with whatever your design tools are. And so it's really easy to overdo the amount of integrations because it just adds a lot of people in the kitchen, so to speak. But if you all are able to have the same perspectives on what your goal is, and the same, you all understand you're working on a boat, not some people think it's a boat, some people think it's a car, then those systems really can work very well together. And so it's really less about the specific tools and more about the team wielding them correctly.
I always end on a question about the favorite aspects of Crowdin to my guests. But before we go there, I want to ask you one more question that's related to the prior topic. What advice would you give to teams trying to retrofit agility into their legacy localization systems that might not be that agile?
Yeah, I would say, take a second, understand what you're solving for. From the localization folks side, they I would recommend that they think about how complex a coding system really is. In order to write a piece of code that is black and white and inject human language nuance into it is a really difficult process. And so to have patience with your dev team, from the dev side, I would say, the tools that you're using, the frameworks you're using, are not there to make your technical lives easier. They're there to inject human language into a piece of code. And so a lot of the times the decisions you're going to have to make are against computer engineering efficiency for the purpose of human language efficiency. And so I would say having that common understanding can really ease so many of the symptoms that a lot of companies have whenever they're trying to be agile, is just by using the same understanding. And so you'll notice there's a theme in this conversation, is that it's really not about the tools. But in particular with Crowdin, one real, I guess that'll be the next question, but I think Crowdin definitely adds a lot of tools to help with that. So
what's your favorite one? That's the last question, Aaron. Go ahead, fire it off.
Yeah, I think the one I personally come across with most is the CI/CD integration. And so the process of connecting your GitHub repo into your Crowdin account, that is just killer. And it makes the lives of devs so much easier. And then it also allows localization folks to just log into Crowdin and make translations on the fly, deploy without a developer needing to really spend too much time on it. And so that's an example of a tool that is really great if everyone's on the same page, but any tool can cause friction if the two sides of the equation are kind of misunderstanding each other.
Awesome. Aaron Presley, thank you so very, very much spending some time with us and waking up early on the West Coast, I should say as well. And we hope to catch you again sometime later. Until then, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan.
Well, folks, that's a wrap on today's episode of the Agile Localization Podcast by Crowdin. We hope you found it as insightful as we did. If you enjoyed today's conversation and want to learn more about how leading companies are managing their multilingual content efficiently, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. Thank you for tuning in. For more resources on how to streamline your localization process, visit crowdin.com. See you next time.